Alright guys, TouchCrumb back again today, hopefully enjoying your Monday so far, and today I wanted to talk about the Minnesota ROKKR. The Minnesota home series is coming up this weekend, shaping up of course to be a very spicy one. We've got Chicago Hunts, we've got the Dallas Empire and Atlanta FaZe all attending this one. Of course, predictions will be coming later in the week as with all the normal coverage, but today I want to talk about the home team, that being the Minnesota ROKKR. They had a really good start to the season. As of late they have slowed down quite significantly, and there has been some discussion over the last few days surrounding whether this team should consider making a roster change. Something that is not out of the question, right? You look right here at the Seattle home series last weekend. Huntsman, Royal Ravens, OpTic Gaming Los Angeles, Subliners, top four. All four of these teams have struggled earlier in the season and then made a roster change and come back to the top. That's not essential to turn around a struggling roster. We've seen on the Team Envy squad, for example, in the Infinite Warfare season, they have a really rough start to the season, but then they have the same squad, turn it around for Stage 2 and Champs, where they make the Grand Finals, losing both times to OpTic Gaming squad at the time. But all that being said, obviously, a roster change can make a difference. But is this the right caliber of team or the right construction of a team to make that work? I'm intrigued to hear your thoughts down below. Like if you guys enjoyed the video, subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Let's hop right into things then. So, of course, GodRx really has been the star player on this team at the start of the season. He was phenomenal the first few events. The last couple of events online haven't been so good for him. And it honestly must be said, I think, and I did say this in my prediction video a few weeks ago, that look, I don't think Minnesota are as good online as they are on LAN. GodRx, Assault, and, Asim, I think are relatively similar. But I do think Alex and Silly are somewhat better on LAN than they are online. That being said then, it feels like there's to some degree you can explain away this Minnesota ROKKR underperformance over the last few weeks. But, they're 4th place in the rankings as we will look at right here. So this is the season as a whole. They had a good opening few events as we were looking in a second. They're still sitting 4th in league standings right now. Yes, there are, some teams like Ultra and Florida Mutineers do have an event in hand over them. But, even after this weekend, we're probably expecting ROKKR to maintain their placing somewhat. They do have a very difficult finish to the year though, as we will look at in a few minutes time here. So yes, they're still sitting top 4. For a lot of people, they would have had ROKKR as their top 4 team at least some point in the season. For a large portion of the season early on, I think that was true. But as of late, it's clearly not the case, right? And I think Nameless made a great point on the Contesting the Point podcast. Maybe I'll put some clips of that on screen right now. And there's also a nice clip of Asim getting, frying in scrims that I'll put on screen in a second here. But he made the point effectively that early season, teams that are built around chemistry are not necessarily around top tier gun skill. Those kind of teams that understand the game well and often have early upset victories against teams with more talent, late season, that's when they start to fall off. And we have seen that over and over again, and I think we are seeing that over the last few weeks with the Minnesota ROKKR. Will that trend continue? Who knows? So, ROKKR find themselves in a good spot, right? Kind of similar to how the Midnight Esports team last season had such a good start. Then that whole roster of Envoy, Brack & Co. broke up. Then Parasite & Co. joined onto the team and they inherited a pretty good spot in the standings. ROKKR right now are top 4. Later in the season, will that go down at all? Like, what are we potentially looking at over the next few events? Because they have a difficult one. But right now, they're in the 4th place seed. That's a very advantageous position to be in given this Champs playoffs bracket. They would be playing right now the winner of Florida or Paris Legion. Then they'd have to play up against, if they do, if they do win that match, then they'd have to play against the Huntsmen as it stands right now, but they're not too far away from making it to the World Championship Grand Final. If you drop down into 9th through 12th, you're in a really tough spot. And if you move out of the top 4, then all of a sudden it makes it a lot more difficult for you to make it all the way through, even though you do still start from the winner's bracket at the very least. So look, this is their results over the course of the season. Win early on at their own, the launch weekend weekends. It was in Minnesota as it happens at the time. They were a good squad early on, right? Like Atlanta, they do decent. Los Angeles, they make the grand finals, beating Atlanta FaZe, who beat them the previous event. They, they beat Atlanta FaZe in a 3-2 fashion before losing to Dallas Empire 3-2 on LAN. Then we go into the online stuff of the Dallas home series. They make another grand finals before losing to the Florida Mutineers at that one. But since then, it's kind of been on a downhill trajectory. They've, they've beat Florida Mutineers again, lost to Ultra, lost to Subliners, beat New York, or beat OpTic Gaming. Then they've lost to Huntsman, lost to OpTic Gaming again. And a couple of these series, right, like these 3-0, not necessarily stomps, like against the Subliners, it was very close. Some of the maps against Huntsman and OpTic were close, but the fact that the last 3 series they have lost have all been 3-0 sweeps just doesn't bode well for this team over time. And it's as we were talking about with the power rankings quite recently, you look at a squad like the Florida Mutineers, they've showed so much promise, but their most recent event, they went 0-6 map count. And that really is detrimental to how the power rankings are looking, in my opinion. So look, the fact that you see a lot of green here, slowly turning into a fair more bit of red, does say to me that, look, this team's probably on a more of a downhill trajectory, and it's not like things get any easier for them if we look at, well, how this weekend is going to look. So, as you can see over the course of the season, LA, Dallas, second place, Atlanta, they came top 4. As of late, though, 5th, 6th, and I'm not going to say it gets any easier for them, because let's have a look at these next few weekends. Their own ROKKR home series, they were in this group with FaZe and Dallas Empire in the Seattle Surge. Even if they beat Dallas Empire, it's still going to be a tough job them getting out of this pool, because, it's if Surge don't do anything, as a lot of people are expecting them not to do something, then if Minnesota even beat Dallas Empire first, they've got to play FaZe, then they've probably got to play Dallas Empire again, right? And just as we saw at the most recent home series, they beat OpTic Gaming 3-2 first, they play them again, they get 3-0'd, right? So not looking good for ROKKR. Then the next one they play in is the New York home series in a group with Huntsman, Royal Ravens, and Subliners. 3 teams that are massively improved. Of course, 3 teams that were in the top 4 of the most recent event. So very scary group again. Then the one after that, the final one they play in, is the Toronto Ultra home series, again with FaZe and Dallas Empire in their pool. So very difficult bracket for them. For some reason, these two matches are back-to-back, but they are in the same bracket. I just checked that out before this video. So ROKKR have a very difficult close to the season, and I'm not really sure that their current roster and their current trajectory is enough to consistently get out of these pools, because if they place like top 5, 6 at any of every single event, they only get like 10 points. They're going to get overtaken by someone, you would imagine, at some point. So this is what it looks like overall this season in terms of slaying power. You've got GodRx and Assault. As of late, GodRx hasn't had a couple of great events. He's, not necessarily fallen off, but slaying wise, he has certainly fallen off. I think the most recent one, he had like a 0.89 or something like that. Alex has been phenomenal this entire season. Asim is, he's the route man, I guess. He kind of does it all when it needs to be done, but he's not exactly going to put up the greatest numbers. Silly's been relatively solid, but, this team was built on chemistry. It was built on the idea that, look, we might not have the best gun skill and the best talent on the squad in theory, but we understand the game better than you, and we're going to hit the rotations harder, and we're going to play a better fundamental game. Fact of the matter is, later it goes in the season, the more likely it is that teams like OpTic Gaming and Chicago, especially at the most recent event, really show some great fundamental Call of Duty, especially in the hardpoint, as we talked about with Huntsman and OpTic Gaming as well, to some great degree. So, could you make the case this team should be thinking about a change? I certainly think you can. You look at the rest of the season, you look at their top 4 position right now, and you could probably argue that, look, are they going to hold on to that with this current roster, with the groups they have in coming events? Yeah, it's difficult to say, right? Do we need to add more slaying power to get out of these groups that have Atlanta and Dallas in them, which is going to be a very, very tough time indeed? Maybe you could argue that you do. If that is the case, though, what change do you even think about making, right? Because that's where this thing gets tough. You can think all you like and theory craft about how this roster should make a change, and it could step up the team to the next level, because they've got a lot of talent on this squad, but it's not quite, it's not world-class talent, I would say, right on the very top level of Call of Duty, and there are some players out there which could potentially improve a squad like this, right? However, how feasible are those players to acquire? That, of course, is the question. This is their roster as it stands right now. So the 5 men that are on the team. Then you've got Exceed and Tiny on the bench. These are players that have done something in previous seasons, but are they a player that you can sub in and it's going to make them a better team? I don't really think so. The only realistic player you could think about trading, I suppose, is Asim, I guess, because, you could think about Silly as well, but Assault, GodRx, and Alex just have to stay on the starting lineup. So then you're thinking about, okay, Asim or Silly, but Asim's the guy who's always going to run in first, and you saw that nice clip earlier everyone in the video. Like, he's kind of frying. It gets to the point where he's playing a difficult role on the squad. So do you keep Asim? Do you not? Maybe you trade him out for someone who you think maybe can run that role a little bit better. I don't know. I feel like in the past Asim has sometimes been a little bit overzealous, but he seems to be improving, to be honest. So it's tough to argue that you can make that change. Then you look at Silly and it's like, well, he's a world champion. Like, how do you justify, if you are over at Minnesota management, any of these roster changes for one of your substitutes? I don't really think you can, right? So if you're not going to make a substitute change, which I don't really blame them if they don't, I think that's perfectly understandable to stick with the starting five. Maybe then you look at players outside of the organization right now. Looking at the likes of Gunless, right? I talked about at the time, where does Gunless go? Is Minnesota a fit? At the time I said, look, I don't really think so, given that I believe that Minnesota are going for this whole chemistry thing, and Gunless has not been the best player for teams' chemistries over time, right? And therefore I thought that there's no way that Minnesota are even going to think about getting him, and maybe that is true, maybe that is not true, because in theory, Gunless is just such a fantastic player. Like, Gunless for Silly, for example, like, could that take the team to the next level? I don't doubt it, but, you know, in the short term, maybe that's the solution. Long term, it's probably not one, right? But then again, if you are looking at these pools and you're thinking, how do I beat Atlanta? How do I beat Dallas? You know, Gunless is probably sitting there thinking, like, I know how to beat these teams. So, you know, maybe that's something that you could consider. Also, just wanted to mention that some people have been talking lately about the Toronto Ultra roster. And I can definitely see some merits to making a change like this, right? Because you look at the Ultra right now, they've got the starting lineup, which has been pretty good. I'm honestly, you know, I've got high hopes for this team this coming weekend. Classic's been using the Uzi and Scrims, which I might talk about tomorrow. But then you've got the sub bench, right? This Toronto, I think they call it like the Toronto Black or whatever roster, something like that. They're scrimming with it and they're still getting some practice in. But, you know, they're never, you know, it's unlikely that they're going to be making major roster changes. The starting lineup for Toronto, maybe a one in, one out kind of change for the rest of the season. But they seem to have had a pretty solid starting lineup for a while now. And they seem to be doing kind of well. So if you're in Toronto's shoes, maybe you could consider some sort of loan option, as Benson and maybe Nameless and Co were talking about on the CoDcast podcast. Thinking about, like, look, a guy like Looney, for example, maybe he could be that missing piece to a squad like Minnesota ROKKR. If you want to go crazy, maybe get Looney and Gunless from the Rise Nation team back in the day, because they gelled pretty well on that squad. Maybe that's even a thing you can consider if you're the Minnesota ROKKR right now, given that Looney's sitting there on the bench. And I think maybe at the start of the season, there was a thought for Minnesota that they could, or for Toronto even, that they could have their starting lineup play in the professional scene, and then this substitute roster could play in the amateur scene. That's not how it works, right? Because you can only have two of your players from the amateur scene on one of the challengers teams. So these guys can just scrim on their own, but if they want to play challenger stuff, they have to kind of split up. Not ideal, so I can imagine from a business perspective, especially with the pandemic, maybe it could make sense for a squad like Toronto to think about trying to cut costs by loaning some of these players out, or even just selling them all together if Minnesota are looking for a change like that. So that's something that maybe could be considered. A guy like Kleenex, for example, could do a good job on this Minnesota squad in theory. Maybe as that aggressive sub, swap him out for Asim, see how that goes. It just seems to me that, look, if this team continues on the trajectory it has, we'll have to see. Maybe they completely prove me wrong this weekend and make it out their group and this video becomes irrelevant, right? But if they don't, I really feel like the upcoming events are going to be very difficult for them, and I just think they should at least seriously consider a roster change and what potential could be on the market to step their team up to the next level. But maybe you guys completely disagree. Intrigued to hear your thoughts down below. Like if you guys enjoyed the video, subscribe if you're new as always. Thanks for watching as always, and I'll see you next time.